So much, Bernd. Thank you to Frias, to his directors, Ben, and also Gunther Schulz here present, to the staff of Frias. I've been enjoying a very good time in Frias, and it's a deep honor to be here, a deep pleasure, and in a sense also a deep burden. And I would like to discharge this burden in a way that is completely related to this talk today. I consider this talk mainly for the students, knowing that they were coming here. But I'm insisting on the burden because it's the best way to think about taxation. It's starting precisely from the burden. So I may say that Frias for me it's a kind of tax system, and I feel the burden. But this burden is not necessarily a weight on my shoulder. So the problem with taxation, when we talk about taxation and burden, it can be, can we conceive another way of thinking about taxation in a way that is not necessarily perceived as a burden? And perhaps this kind of burden, it's even something better than a weight, because we may urge to be, to restitute this gift that we have received, and we may feel quite happy to restitute this gift. So the burden in that case is not going to be perceived as something that is a true burden. It's something that we would like to discharge, but sometimes doing even better or with what we have. And today what I'd like to do is to do the best I can with what I have, scarce resources in a sense, but paying taxes is always related to this issue. So let's start first of all from our ignorance, or well, let's start on the contrary, from what we perhaps are completely sure to know about taxation. This is perhaps the only certainty. As Benjamin Franklin once said, in this world nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. In other words, it's as if we know something about taxation. This is perhaps the only certainty. We know that sooner or later the tax day, as death, will be coming. But this seems to be the only thing that we know. The rest is a kind of reign of ignorance. It's a reign of confusion. Our opinions, our beliefs about taxation and tax systems are very much confused in a sense. They may range from taxation is legalized theft to le tasse sono una cosa bellissima. Taxation is a beautiful thing, as a minister of the Italian Republic once said, Tommaso Paolo Schioppa. Of course, reality is much more complicated and it's full of nuances of grays. And so we may say we live this kind of schizophrenia when we say, I hate pay taxes, I hate taxes, but nevertheless I like all this kind of stuff that I get from taxation. Schools, roads, firefighters, police officers, hospitals, paramedics, hazmat teams, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and so forth. So the topic of today is an attempt to try to see, at least an attempt to try to see whether we can, in a sense, solve this sort of schizophrenia, or to rejoin the two sides of the coins. I hate paying taxes, but I like all the stuff that this system of taxes allows me to do. The driving and leading question of this talk are, do we know how much we as citizen taxpayers pay to the state and how much we receive from it? Do we or should we really care about the knowledge of burdens and benefits of taxation? And if so, why? These two questions, of course, raises other more fundamental questions, like why should we pay taxes and how should we share the burdens of taxation? The first one is more related to the issue of freedom. The second one is more related to the issue of justice. We will simply touch them very quickly. They will be a little bit running underground of this talk. So I decided to structure this talk into 5 parts. The first one is to do with the fiscal illusion, in a sense what we don't know. The second one is the problem of burdens of taxation. The third one, the benefits of taxation. The fourth one, an attempt to put them together, burdens and benefit, in order to reach a kind of big picture tax justice. Let's start with fiscal illusions. The theme of fiscal illusion was first developed by the Italian scholar. It's a famous Italian scholar. Indeed, it was mainly unknown till the middle of the 50s, when the Nobel laureate in economics, James Buchanan rediscovered him. His name is Amilcare Puviani, and he wrote this book on teoria della illusione finanziaria, theory of fiscal illusions, right at the beginning of the 20th century. And his main claim was that we are completely ignorant about the issues related to the tax system. If you open the book, you will find this quote right at the beginning of the book. I just limited myself to read the first one, which is a quote from Il Principe, The Prince, by Machiavelli. It says, "The vulgar are always taken by what a thing seems to be. And in the world there are only the vulgar, for the few find a place there only where the many have no ground to rest on." What's the meaning of this quote for Puviani? He was mainly concerned with the fact that fiscal illusions are a kind of subspecies of political illusions. We are manipulated, according to Puviani, and therefore we don't know so many things about taxation. In particular, the fiscal illusion is defined by Puviani as a mixture of ignorance on the one hand, but also a wrong representation and or misperception of burdens, revenues in particular, and benefits, expenditure, which means that we don't know quantity of how much we pay, the quality of the expenditure, the time, duration, allocation of tax burdens and benefit aims, and or medium long-term effects of taxes. The list, it's a kind of taxonomy that he created just to explain the many sources of ignorance. In a sense, the causes of this fiscal illusion are kind of a joint causes, to be more precise. It's a mixture of passivity of citizen taxpayer and activities of politicians, because we are manipulated, according to Puviani. We are manipulated, at least in the sense, and when they are doing, just to give you an example, and a little bit more example you can find here. We are manipulated when they are during when they are doing electoral campaign. They promise a lot, for example. They overemphasize the benefits of taxes, and they perhaps minimize the burdens of taxation. So we always have this problem, according to Puviani, together and also because of our passivity, we always have this problem of misrepresenting and or misperceiving the burdens and benefits of taxation. The VAT tax is an example of how much this burden is fragmented along an endless array of expenditure during the year. And that's why, for example, we do not perceive how much we pay. We may say, okay, we know how much we pay when we go to our tax consultant, but nevertheless, this is just a part of the story. Along the year, we pay lots of VAT taxes. Another example is due to the complexity of the fiscal system. But this is perhaps not a problem of fiscal illusion, as we will see later. Of these theories, many scholars have been trying to apply this theory to many fields, just to explain the size of public sector, for example, and the size of the public debt, the lack of fiscal democracy, the political business cycle, as I said before, when politicians are used to spend lots of money just for consensus and so forth. And even recently, in the case of the economic crisis of Greece. Others have been trying to use this theory even to criticize the Obamacare and Obama aid policies. It's time to face fiscal illusion, an author, Tyler Cowen, said on the New York Times. He was fearing the problem of the burden that sooner or later will come with this excess, according to him, excess of expenditures. Some has proposed solutions to the fiscal illusions, like why don't we think about having enlightened and vigilant economies? Perhaps they may be capable of enlightening us of all these problems that may be coming from our fiscal illusions. And he said, economists should then denounce fiscal illusion to show how people are paying more than they receive. Academics should be examining public budget and taxation schemes to try to avoid having to wonder who is going to pay for the delusion when the illusionist finishes performing. I'm not sure whether these are the right answers to the problem of fiscal illusions. We may perhaps start from the limits of this theory. The theory of fiscal illusion, in one sense, considered just one aspect of the problem, of the pathological relationship between taxpayer and political elites, but neglects the coordination role of institutions, for example, and neglects the horizontal relation among taxpayers. Puviani was mainly concerned with this problem of political manipulation, but it didn't take into account the very simple fact that sometimes we pay taxes simply because we trust our authorities, or simply because we have a sense of civic duty, or because we trust our fellow citizens, and so forth. So the problem of cognitive misrepresentation, and this is the second limit, is not always related to a matter of manipulation. Tax system sometimes is simply complex, and tax laws are very much complex. So there is an issue of unavoidable ignorance that we cannot avoid. But this is not necessarily a problem. I mean, we don't need to take care of every aspect of public life. We don't need to know every aspect of public life. We do our jobs, and we are not necessarily involved in any sort of political decisions. And in the end, there is a problem with this notion of illusion, because Puviani never stated clearly what this illusion is. In a sense, in order to have an illusion, you have to have something that is not an illusion. In order to say that this is an illusion, you need to know something that is not an illusion. And Puviani never said what exactly is manipulated, what exactly this kind of politicians, canny politicians, are used to manipulate. I would surmise, or I would like to think that it's trust that is usually manipulated. Our trust, of course, in the system, our trust in politicians, and so forth. To explain this point, it's better to turn now to the second part, burdens of taxation. Usually, the classic way to think about the burdens of taxation is to measure the tax revenue to GDP ratio. This is a classic graph, or the distribution of this tax revenue to GDP ratio in EU countries. The tax revenue to GDP ratio indicates the share of a country's output that is collected by the government through taxes. Overall taxes, including all forms of direct and indirect taxation at all levels of government. To simplify things a bit, many scholars or research centers have been trying to communicate the meaning of this burden in another way. One of the classic examples of this is the Heritage Foundation Index of Fiscal Freedom. They simply calculate this index in a way that includes also the top marginal tax rate on individual income and the top marginal tax rate on corporate income. So it's a way, you may think, it's a way to solve the problem of fiscal illusion, to say, okay, now we know how much we pay, we know the burden. But at an individual level, things are much more complex. Another classic example of communicating the story of the burden, it's related to these indexes of fiscal freedom that are, in this case, another foundation. They are calculating the day starting from which we stop paying taxes, we stop paying or working, as they say, for the government, and we start working for ourselves. So in this graph you see that, for example, if you look at Italy, I mean, we are supposed to work till the end of June just for the government, and the rest of the year we are working for ourselves. Now, what's wrong with this way of thinking about the Tax Freedom Day? To simplify a bit the things, I may say, well, let's remember first the merit. Of course, they may enlighten us on the burdens of taxation, so they may improve, in a sense, our knowledge of the tax burden. But on the other hand, there are limits and objections that we cannot avoid, because there is a huge risk of reductionism and misrepresentation, or that may lead sometimes even to misperception, both of the tax burden and the freedom. To simplify the issue, we may wonder, for example, whether we can truly measure the entity of the burden and, above all, the quantity of freedom. So what about the individual and or cultural perception of burden and freedom? Here there is a classic problem, as epistemologists are used to say, of theory-ledness. The measurement of burden as well as of freedom is highly biased, perhaps from by their notion of freedom. I will explain this in a while. And secondly, there is a problem of perception of the burden that is highly, and the freedom that is highly subjective as well as context dependent. To give you some historical examples, consider that in the midst of the 19th century, Queen Victoria was quite surprised to know that the Parliament was trying to enact a law that was going to introduce an income tax of about 3.33%. And she said, aren't we exaggerating? The perception of the burden, of course, it's an issue that is highly context dependent and cultural dependent. And secondly, we may turn this logic a little bit upside down, that by saying, why don't we celebrate the Tax Solidarity Day instead of the Tax Freedom Day? I may try to be a little bit more provocative by saying, why don't we celebrate the Tax Slavery Day? The Tax Slavery Day, it's the first day of the year in which a nation as a whole stops earning money for itself and starts paying its taxes. You see, this is another form of illusion, perhaps. You may simply use the same technique of calculation, and you may invert the logic of what is freedom and what is burden, and you may have a completely different communicative effect. But the technique of calculation remains the same. So in the end, we may wonder whether this way of thinking about burdens and freedom, it's nothing but a zero-sum game. There are many other troubles that I would like to discuss later, perhaps in the question time and the question and answer moment. So, but I would like to stress the problem of this dichotomy that has to do with the fact that we start from a very specific notion of freedom, first of all. Freedom from. The reason why we conceive this tax burden as a burden is because we start from a notion of freedom that has to do with the idea of freedom from coercion, freedom from intrusion, freedom from chains. This is the classic idea of negative freedom and also negative rights in many respects. But this may lead us to quite paradoxical conclusion. For example, given the existence of tax thresholds in any countries, tax thresholds are those thresholds below which no taxes are to be paid. We are not supposed to pay taxes if we do not earn enough money. We may say that the more we are poor, the more we are free, because under these thresholds, we should be free in a sense, because we are not bearing any kind of burden. So this is a quite paradoxical conclusion, but this is consistent with the premises of this way of thinking. So more misery should imply more freedom, but this is a kind of miserable conception of freedom. Last but not least, we may say we may wonder whether this way of thinking the burden may lead to another form of fiscal illusion or to another form of illusion, because they are simply taking into account the side of the burden of the public budget, but of course they completely do not take into account the side of the benefits. So there is also an ontological and epistemological problem. Let's turn to the benefit of taxation. A way to think about the benefit of taxation is, this is a very famous quote by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, is taxes are what we pay for a civilized society. But as you may say in this quotation, there is still a kind of tension between the burdens and benefit. It's as if we were saying war is the price that we have to pay for peace. You notice that there is a tension, that it's a little bit unresolved. So it's still a way to think about the benefit, but to justify the benefit starting from the sacrifice. In a way, many attempts have been done to justify or to enlighten the beauty, so to say, of the side of taxation by saying, okay, rights depends on our taxes. This famous book by two legal scholars, Stephen Holmes and Constantine, The Cost of Rights, Why Liberty Depends on Taxes, is mainly based on this claim. Taxes are a precondition of rights. This basic claim can be subdivided into two other claims. The first one is statelessness spells rightlessness. A legal right exists in reality only when and if it has budgetary costs, of course. Secondly, the financing of basic rights through tax revenues help us see clearly that rights are public goods, taxpayer-funded and government-managed social services designed to improve collective and individual well-being. So all rights in this regard are positive rights. Instead of thinking about the negative conception of freedom, they are simply saying, well, we cannot distinguish so easily the negative freedom from positive freedom. And we pay taxes because we get something in return. And we may also have other normative conclusions if we start from these premises, like however hard people work, it is always an oversimplification to attribute differences of acquired wealth solely to the wealthy's own efforts. A similar attempt was also tried by other two scholars. We will see them in a while. But before analyzing this, I would like to stress one point that you will find right at the conclusion of this book. You may say, okay, I may agree with them, but if you look at the appendix of the book, you will find something quite surprising. Some numbers on rights and their costs. They published the 1996 budget of the United States as if they were justifying this cost of rights, but they conclude with this striking conclusion. Although we have occasionally referred to some numbers, it has not been our purpose in this book to offer a quantitative assessment of the cost of rights. Precise figure may be impossible to produce. So it's as if they were, saying the cost of rights from, as you can read from the cover of the book. But this cost of rights seems not to be so easily calculable. So it's difficult, they have to admit, in the end, to disaggregate various expenditures so as to come up with dollar expenditures per right. So once again, you see that it's very difficult to, rejoin the two sides of the coin of the benefits and burdens. We pay taxes. We know that with these taxes, we are benefit a little bit in terms of rights, negative and positive rights, but it's not easy to attribute the value of these rights in terms of the public budget. A similar claim was put forward by these two scholars, Liam Murphy and Thomas Nagel, on the myth of ownership. And it's a very similar claim, even though the book is mainly dealing with the issue of justice in taxation. And the basic claim is, without the government, no market or property right would exist. We may agree with this, but as I would like to stress once more, this kind of arguments can be troublesome in many respects, and they can once more be easily turned upside down. For example, we may say, okay, without individual contribution, there would be nothing for the law to protect. Or, to be more drastic, without individual contribution, there would be no government. So you see here that there is a problem, once again, of a sort of zero-sum game, or kind of dichotomy fallacy. It's as if we were facing a kind of chicken and egg situation. Who comes first? Our taxes, the government, our taxes, and so forth. So to the answer, the question, are we facing a chicken and egg situation? We may answer yes and no. Depends on the kind of circle that is involved in our social relationship. It depends on whether the circle is a virtuous or a vicious circle. And this is also linked to the issue of the social bond. Usually the issue of the burdens and benefit of taxation has been addressed as an issue of justice, because at least the idea of social justice has to do with, as I told you at the beginning, with the issue, how should we share the burdens and benefits of taxation as members of a society? Here you see a classic representation of this idea of commutative and distributive justice. But the main theories of tax justice have been, having hard times to answer to this question. Because if you try to find or to search for a perfect measure of justice, you will find, or you will come across the same kind of troubles that we have met before with measuring freedom. So it's not also easy to measure justice. As Luigi Einaudi once said, just in the distribution of taxation is measured with the raw-hewn scale of the eye and the hand, a kind of rule of thumb, not by the fine-tuned scales of the goldsmith. And these standard theories of tax justice, the benefit received principle and the ability to pay principle, met the same kind of troubles that we mentioned before. For example, the benefit received principle states that individuals should pay taxes in proportion to the benefit they receive from public goods and services. It's a kind of quid pro quo. We pay taxes, but we want to get something in return. But this quid pro quo is very difficult to calculate. Think about the fact that the defense, for example, may save our life. So how much is worth our life? Or this may be the same for healthcare service, because they may save our life, but the benefit that we get in return is very, very high compared perhaps to what we pay. And there are many other technical issues involved with the problem of calculation of the benefit, but the same we may say for the ability to pay principle. The ability to pay principle simply stated individuals should pay taxes in proportion to their ability to pay or their taxable capacity, regardless of the benefit received. Both principles, in many respects, have to find limits because they do not succeed in calculating exactly the individual benefit and burdens. If we start to wonder how to calculate this quid pro quo, how is the ability to pay to be defined, and above all, what is the right taxable capacity? Of course, you may have to take into account wealth, consumption, income, and so forth, or a mixture of them, as it often happens in reality. But to find the exact measure of justice as a sort of equalization of all these burdens and benefits is very, very difficult. And for both principle, the benefit received principle and the ability to pay principle, there is an issue of justice that is on the one hand merely measured or merely focused, on the benefit, and on the other merely focused on the burden. So it's as if once again we are facing this problem of rejoining the two sides of the coin, but we are not at all successful. And last but not least, these two principles share a notion of justice as proportion. So how to get out from this kind of problems? First of all, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. This is a quote by the sociologist Cameron. To explain this point, we may think about the social relationship between citizen, taxpayer, and tax authorities and government in terms of trust, with the logic of virtues once again and virtuous cycles, like trust breeds trust. Two scholars, Feld and Fry, analyzed this empirically, but there are many other empirical studies about the fact that there are the studies on the field of tax compliance, as it is called. These studies have shown very well that citizens do not pay taxes for the very simple reason that they are coerced, or because they fear the coercion or the burden or to be punished by the government, but because there are many other issues involved in paying taxes, like I feel, as I said at the beginning, a sense of civic virtue. I trust these authorities, and of course the virtuous cycle of trust or distrust. It's a critical element to explain this relationship. So they, for example, said there is a kind of psychological tax contract between citizens and government, which goes a little bit beyond the rigorous equivalence between paying taxes and receiving public goods, as long as the political process is perceived to be fair and legitimate. So we do not really want to calculate exactly this quid pro quo, or usually we don't do that. Perhaps we are much more concerned with the problem of political legitimacy. And if trust be trust, we may say gift breeds gift. So we may wonder whether paying taxes can be a form of gift giving. This is very much connected with the idea of justice in a way, but a different idea of justice, or at least a little bit different from the idea of commutative and distributive justice, because gift implies a different idea or a different notion of justice beyond the mere proportion. Gift giving inevitably implies an incalculable surplus and asymmetry. As the German philosopher Sloterdijk said, in every authentic exchange between human beings, the advantage of giving is unbridgeable. Justice can only be thought beyond the symmetry between giving and taking. It can never be imagined without injustice and unilateralism. Consequently, the act of responding can never end up in the equal return of a gift received. The right answer can only be a further giving with which an asymmetrical relationship is established again. He was dreaming perhaps about the possibility of realizing a society entirely based on voluntary taxation. Of course, we don't need to think about a society entirely based on voluntary taxation. We may encounter lots of practical problems to realize such a society. For example, we will still have to solve the problem of coordination. Imagine that we are very much generous and we would like to pay our taxes voluntarily. But then we will always have to solve the problem of how to redistribute this money, at least to those who benefits or are in need, for example. So you may say that I would like to show you a kind of third way, that is the percentage philanthropy mechanism, which can be conceived as a kind of third way between coercion and freedom, or also in between some idea of justice as a form of gift. This percentage philanthropy mechanism is a mechanism by which taxpayer can freely designate a certain percentage of their income tax to churches, specific non-profit, non-governmental organization, scientific or health research, or entities whose main activities of public interest. So this is the box that you find on your tax form in Italy, which is this mechanism exists in Italy, but also in some Central and Eastern European countries. You may decide freely who is the beneficiary of your taxes, your income tax. And so you may simply sign the form and say, I want to give the money to Médecins Sans Frontières or whoever. This is the kind of advertisement that you will find, especially during this period of the year. They are claiming, donate your taxes to us. Okay. The interesting story about this mechanism is that perhaps we may go a little bit farther the issue of illusion, because this mechanism promotes and strengthens fiscal democracy, direct democracy, and fiscal subsidiarity via the mechanism taxation self-determination and the control over the distribution of taxes. It also realizes a kind of outsourcing of public services. It improves or expands the civil society. And it also develops a culture of giving, and perhaps helps us to realize this transition, never-ending perhaps transition from passive and assisted citizenship to active citizenship. Last but not least, of course, here you don't have any kind of fiscal illusion, because you as citizen taxpayer are the only one who has the right to decide who is the beneficiary. So here it's also beyond, we are also beyond the no taxation without representation mechanism. It's we that decide who is the beneficiary. Of course, we may make some sort of mistake, we may choose the wrong beneficiary of the voluntary sector, for example, but the following year we may change our choice and destinate this money to other entities. Perhaps a way to get out from all these sort of dichotomies, dilemmas, difficulties, it's to depict the fiscal system in another way, through the lens of the gift. If you think about the standard definition of levies and taxes, levies are paid in change of something received by the taxpayer, while taxes are paid without anything in return. These two way of thinking are, of course, ideal typical, but resemble very much the benefit received principle and the ability to pay principle. We may say, well, this way of thinking is very much similar to the problem of the tension between exchange and gift. So if you consider a standard opposition between self-interest and altruism, or purely utilitarian exchange and purely gratuitous gift, you may simply say that these two extremes are merely ideal. In a sense, if gift breeds gift, and also the social bond, we may think about the tax system as a mechanism that improves in a way, or that is deeply ingrained in our way of thinking the social bond. We may define, as Calais and Godbout once said, we may define as a gift every lending of goods or services effected without guarantee of restitution towards the end of creating, nourishing, or recreating the social bond between the people involved. So in a sense, when we pay taxes, we can legitimately expect something in return, even though this return is not guaranteed. And perhaps the way to rethink the social bond through the tax system is to think about this logic of virtuous and vicious cycles, or the logic of positive or negative reciprocal debts occurring when the individual is convinced to give less or more than she receives. In any kind of situation like this one, of positive or negative debts, but in particular in the case of positive reciprocal debts, everyone has something to gain, fueling mutual trust and social ties. Because in this case, trust arises and remains in a situation where everyone wins. So the final question is, how can we imagine, visualize the social bond operating at public budget level and rejoin the two sides of the same coin, thus revenues and expenditure, burdens and benefit. I hate taxes, but I like, etc., etc. Well, my answer is just a suggestion. We may restart to rethink this kind of aesthetic of society, of any good or bad society and good and bad government. These are images of the allegory of good and bad government that you can find in the civic building of Siena. The author of this big fresco is Ambrogio Lorenzetti. He depicted this fresco at the beginning of the 14th century, and is considered to be one of the most powerful representation of the idea of good and bad society, especially in medieval age. But perhaps it tells us something also today. If we look at these images, we see, for example, the images of justice that takes into her hands these two cords that are going down to the allegory of Concordia. You can read Concordia right here. Well, these two cords starts from the two places of the balance of justice, and they go to this allegory of Concordia. And notice that these two cords are, in a sense, handed over to this procession of the citizens. And I would like to interpret this idea of Concordia as if Lorenzetti were saying, okay, this is not only an idea of harmony or social bond, but also literally Concordia, staying together, and the thread that tied us together is not necessarily coercive, it's not necessarily a burden. It's a bond that is perhaps something that allows us to develop our freedom in a better way. So to conclude, the message by Lorenzetti was this one. This holy virtue, justice, where she rules, induced to unite the many souls of citizens. And they, gathered together for such a purpose, make the common good, the bene comune, their lord. And he, in order to govern his state, chooses never to turn his eyes from the resplendent faces of the virtues who sits around him. Therefore, to him, in triumph, are offered taxes, tributes, and lordship of towns. Therefore, without war, every civic result duly follows, useful, necessary, and pleasurable. And perhaps this is not an illusion. Thank you. And let me remind you the final lecture, The Myth of Ignorance in Biology. Thank you.
Well, what else could I promise? The human foundations of fiscal democracy. So